hope you're having an excellent day today. Today we're actually going to be answering a question for Julian, and Julian wants to know how to make his sounds more mono compatible. So I hope this video is helpful for you guys, and without further ado, let's jump right into it. So before we actually go into our DAW, I actually want to talk about a few definitions that we're going to be going over and referring back to time and time again throughout this video. So first off, let's talk about what audio is. Now, audio is a series of peaks and troughs throughout the audio spectrum. So when we talk about phase cancellation, it's pretty simple. Considering that audio is just a series of peaks and troughs, phase cancellation refers to two signals that actually have an inverse relationship of those peaks and troughs. And the result that comes from this is total cancellation if it is the same signal. Now, if it's a different signal, we're going to get some weird effects. The sounds will still cancel each other out, and most of the time you'll have a really hollow sound with a lot of bass information or low frequency information that actually gets lost through the process. So again, phase cancellation would mean that these two waveforms are out of phase. One is peaking while one is going into a trough. Now inversely, if sounds are in phase, they're both peaking at the same time and they're both troughing at the same time. So the last thing that I want to go over is comb filtering. And comb filtering is a timing offset. So if these signals are offset, meaning that one is a little bit more delayed, we have a strange effect called comb filtering. And when you have comb filtering in your tracks, you're dealing with added and subtracted harmonics. So it's actually interesting to think about because we can use comb filtering to our advantage with effects like flangers and choruses and even phasers. These are taking the effects of comb filtering and making them work for you. So that's kind of interesting to consider when we're talking about phase. Okay, so let's take a closer look at phase cancellation and comb filtering to see exactly kind of what is going on. So here I have the same drum clip and I've just duplicated it onto another track. And so as you can see here, our audio is actually following a pattern of peaks and troughs, and both signals that are combining to make one are the same exact pattern. Now, if I were to actually invert the phase of one of these, or the polarity I should say, it's actually going to flip the peaks and troughs of the channel that we decide to invert. So now our result is that no audio is coming out. So now we can see this if I were to actually render this track in place. So I'll go ahead and do that. And now you can see if we really zoom in, here we have a peak on this clip and a trough in this clip. So the result is 100% cancellation. But we can actually get our sound back by panning to either side. However, if we come back to the master and hit the mono switch, again we have that cancellation. So before we move on to our next example, it's actually important to keep in mind that the signals do not have to be exact duplicates of each other. It actually more determines on the timbre of the sounds, which means the frequencies that these sounds take up. Now, a lot of the time when we go to layer sounds, we're either panning hard right or hard left for each layer, so these problems can be easily hidden in the stereo field. Here I have the same kick drum and I've duplicated it to another track. You can see that we have an inverse relationship of peaks and troughs for the most part. So our second example here is lined up perfectly so that you can hear a bit of a difference between the hollow sounding kick and the more full low end sounding kick. I can definitely tell that a lot of low-end information is actually being lost as a result of this misalignment. So the next example that I want to talk about here is actually multi-mic'd recordings. And this means that you're using two or more microphones to record a singular source. These microphones are going to have different spaces or different lengths of space from the actual source that it's picking up. And because audio is an actual vibration, it takes some time for it to move through the air and actually reach the microphone. So here I just recorded some simple guitar, and as you can see here over at my track delay, I've actually set one of them to compensate for the amount of time that it actually takes for the source to reach that microphone. So this is with the delay compensation. So now what I've done is I've actually reduced the compensation to 0. And again, you'll hear a great loss of low end. Sounds very thin and hollow, although we have 2 tracks playing back the same exact signal. So you'll see as I move this slider, the sound really starts to thicken up around -55 to -60 samples. So another way that we could do this is actually inverting the polarity of one of these microphones and then waiting until we've got some good cancellation happening. So here again, that's that really thin sound. So I know if I go and I uninvert this polarity, we'll be pretty close to phase. I would recommend actually doing this before even starting to record. So I actually wasn't able to achieve full cancellation, but I knew that the sound was becoming so hollowed out that I was in a pretty good place where I could re-invert the polarities, if you will, and put it back to normal so that the microphones would actually be in phase. Now, if your DAW actually doesn't have a delay compensation slider, what you could do instead is actually zoom in quite far, as you saw with the kick drums, and try to actually line up these peaks and troughs here. So one more example that I have for you here actually has to do with parallel processing. Now, especially when you're doing parallel processing with EQ, you have to keep in mind that this will actually change the structure of the peaks and troughs you have going on. So this sounds fine in stereo, but when we go and switch our master to mono, we've lost a ton of information. Now, in my opinion, a great way to tackle this problem would actually be to use mid and side processing. So when we refer to the side, we're talking about the stereo information, and when we refer to the mids, we're talking about the mono information. So a very common technique would actually be to take the low end out of the sides. So I actually like to go even further than this and actually use some stereo imaging. And what I'll actually do is take the width control and lower it. So I know that if I'm mixing in mono, or I'm mixing some elements to mono, that they're going to show up perfectly fine when we actually go and play back our track in mono. So you can hear there's almost no difference. Now definitely I don't have as much width as I had before, but that's okay because we can add things like reverb. The main thing is that we have that mono compatibility. So when it comes to phase, we're mainly dealing with timing issues. So when we talk about peaks and troughs, we're actually talking about how our speaker is going to play back this sound. When we have a peak, the speaker wants to move out towards us. And when we have a trough, the speaker wants to go back in. And that is how it's going to represent that sound. So when we have interfering peaks and troughs, the speaker actually gets confused. To fix this problem, most of the time we can go in and either adjust the timing of a track by manually slipping the clips ourselves or by adjusting the track delay. Now, another thing that we could do is actually invert the polarity altogether. And so if we're dealing with really bad phase misalignment, this is often the best bet and best case scenario. So one last thing that I'd actually like to talk about is mono compatibility. And when we're mixing in stereo, we do have to keep in mind that eventually at one point or another, this track is going to be played back in mono. Now, when we're talking about mono compatibility and making our effects mono, it's a bit more difficult. So here you'll see on my return track, I have a reverb here. Now, when we talk about reverb, let's get a few things straight about the pre-delay. According to something called the Haas effect, anything above, say, 30 to 40 milliseconds, this will actually allow the human ear to distinguish the two sounds. So how does this apply to us? Well, when we're mixing in stereo, I find that if our signals are blending together too much, there's often going to be a vastly different sound when we play it back in mono. But if we actually separate the sounds a little bit using the idea of the Haas effect and increasing our pre-delay, we can actually create a different source than our actual effect. So here again we have our multi-mic recording of the guitar. And so our reverb is still pretty present in the mono field. And you'll see even on this reverb return track, I have the width coming down slightly because this stereo reverb really adds a lot of stereo characteristics. And so knowing that when using this plugin, it's much more helpful to create a more centered effect rather than having the stereo image go crazy. So now let's actually lower this down to 0 milliseconds of pre-delay. Or let's even say like 9 milliseconds, and let's hear the difference. So it sounds fine in stereo, but now if we transfer it over to mono, the effect is a lot less present in my opinion. It's kind of getting buried behind the original source, and I want to hear my reverb, you know? So a lot of the times what I will do is actually work with effects tracks in mono. And once I've found it's good in mono, I will actually go back to the master, take it out of mono, and then make any changes to the stereo version of that effect. In my opinion, some of the best techniques for handling phase issues and mono compatibility issues would actually be just to mix in mono. Now, I'm not saying completely mix in mono, never go back to stereo, but spend a good chunk of your time actually mixing in mono. Not only will this help with phase and mono compatibility, but it will actually make your mixes sit better. Having a right and left channel is kind of like a scapegoat. If I have really bad phase issues and I just pan one to the right and one to the left, it's hidden in the stereo field. So in conclusion, and to answer Julian's question, I would actually recommend mixing in mono. Getting your effects to sound good in mono will translate beautifully to stereo, but the mono mix is probably the hardest facet, and that's due mainly to timing issues. So if we ever find ourselves with timing issues where our mix in mono is sounding floppy and flimsy, all we want to do is identify the problem and try to adjust it using delay compensation or by manually lining up peaks and troughs. Now, if that doesn't work, I'd highly recommend using stereo imaging plugins. As we've seen here, I use the utility device. Now, if that doesn't work, then I would reach for the mid-side processing. And I'd start by high passing the low frequencies in the side information. Once you've done some mid and side processing, if you still find yourself having issues, I would recommend actually going to the device that you're having issues with and seeing if there are any time parameters that you can adjust. As you saw in this reverb here, I felt like we got a lot better sound when we took the Haas effect in mind. Now again, I can't understress how much I use a utility plugin to actually bring down the width of my tracks. I love this feature and I think it should be utilized a lot more. I hope this was helpful in making your tracks more mono compatible. I know that when I was first starting out mixing, this was the hardest thing to do, to get my mix to sound good everywhere I went. But now I've realized that if it sounds good in mono, I don't have to worry, because I know that I've spent the time and I'm putting all of these different elements in their own space without kind of, I don't want to say cheating, but without cheating and using those pan pots to hide any phase issues. So thank you guys for watching, and if there's anything else that you would like to see, leave it down in the comments below and I'll be sure to incorporate it in an upcoming video.